The sterile scent of isopropyl alcohol and the low hum of machinery were the constant companions of my early career. I was fresh out of university, brimming with idealism and a fierce dedication to the principles of public safety, having landed my dream job in the highly regulated world of pharmaceutical manufacturing. My role was in quality assurance, a critical department responsible for ensuring that every single pill, every vial, every batch of medication produced met the stringent standards set forth by federal and international bodies. It wasn't just about paperwork, it was about protecting lives. A single misstep, a forgotten protocol, a contaminated batch, and the consequences could be catastrophic, leading to illness, injury, or even death for countless patients. This wasn't just a job, it was a calling, a responsibility I took with the utmost seriousness. I remember the initial excitement, the pride I felt walking through the gleaming, meticulously clean labs, knowing that my work contributed to something profoundly important. The company, at first glance, seemed to share my values. They spoke of integrity, patient welfare, and adherence to the highest ethical standards. My direct superior, a woman named Eleanor Vance, was initially impressive. She had a commanding presence, a sharp mind, and a reputation for getting things done. She'd been with the company for years, climbing the ranks with what seemed like effortless efficiency. I looked up to her, eager to learn from her experience and absorb every piece of wisdom she offered. However, it wasn't long before the cracks began to show in Eleanor's polished facade. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, with minor deviations from established procedures. Perhaps a batch record wasn't signed off in the correct sequence, or a calibration log for a piece of equipment would be backdated by a day or two. At first, I dismissed these as oversight, the inevitable minor errors that occur in any complex operation. I'd gently point them out, expecting a correction, and Eleanor would brush them off with a dismissive wave of her hand, a quick, "Oh, don't worry about that, it's just a formality. We'll fix it later," or "It's fine, the spirit of the rule is met." Her confidence was disarming, her casual disregard for the minutiae of compliance almost persuasive. But the rules weren't just formalities to me. They were the bedrock of safety, the very framework designed to prevent disaster. My unease began to grow, a quiet, persistent hum beneath the surface of my professional optimism. It was a feeling that something fundamental was being compromised, and I was witnessing it firsthand. The subtle deviations soon escalated into blatant disregard. I started noticing patterns that were far more concerning than simple oversights. There were instances where critical equipment, such as incubators or sterile filtration systems, would be used past their scheduled maintenance dates, or where environmental monitoring logs for cleanrooms would show suspiciously consistent, perfect readings, even when I knew there had been minor excursions. One particularly alarming incident involved a batch of raw material that arrived with a damaged seal, a clear breach of integrity that should have triggered an immediate quarantine and rejection. Instead, Eleanor instructed the receiving team to simply reseal it and mark it as acceptable, citing production deadlines as the justification. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched, knowing that this seemingly small act could compromise the entire batch, potentially affecting thousands of patients. I tried to address these issues directly with Eleanor, always approaching her with data, with the relevant regulations highlighted, and with a calm, professional demeanor. I presented my concerns as opportunities for improvement, as risks that needed mitigation. Each time, her response was a variation of the same theme, a dismissive wave, a patronizing smile, or a thinly veiled threat. "You're too by the book, my name," she'd say, her voice dripping with condescension. "Sometimes you have to be practical. We're a business, not a charity. Do you want to be known as the person who holds up production? The one who can't adapt?" She made it sound as if my adherence to safety was a personal failing, an inability to grasp the bigger picture. She even hinted that my lack of flexibility might impact my career progression within the company. Her tactics were insidious. She'd isolate me, subtly undermining my credibility with other team members by painting me as overly rigid or difficult. If I brought up a concern in a team meeting, she'd quickly deflect, change the subject, or turn it into a joke at my expense. The atmosphere became increasingly toxic. My colleagues, sensing Eleanor's disapproval, began to distance themselves, fearing that association with my troublemaking would reflect poorly on them. I felt a growing sense of dread each morning as I walked into the office. The idealism that had once fueled me was slowly being eroded, replaced by a gnawing anxiety. I was witnessing a systematic dismantling of safety protocols, driven by a relentless pursuit of efficiency and cost-cutting, and I felt utterly powerless to stop it. My reports to Eleanor were not only ignored but seemed to embolden her, as if my objections merely confirmed her belief that she could operate with impunity. The thought of being complicit, even passively, in practices that could harm people was a heavy burden, weighing on my conscience day and night. I knew I couldn't stand by and watch this continue. The internal reporting channels, which were supposed to be a safeguard, proved to be just as ineffective as my direct appeals to Eleanor. The company had an open-door policy, a whistleblower hotline, and a clear chain of command for reporting ethical breaches or safety violations. Naively, I believed these mechanisms would work. I meticulously documented every incident, dates, times, specific protocols violated, and Eleanor's instructions. I gathered photographic evidence where possible, keeping a discreet but comprehensive log of her dangerous shortcuts. My reports went up the chain, first to Eleanor's direct superior, then to human resources, and eventually to the corporate compliance department. Each time, I presented my case calmly, factually, and with the utmost professionalism, emphasizing the potential risks to patient safety and the company's reputation. The responses, or lack thereof, were disheartening. My initial reports were met with polite assurances that the matter would be looked into. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, with no discernible change in Eleanor's behavior or the company's practices. HR advised me to try to work things out amicably with Eleanor, suggesting that perhaps I was misinterpreting her intentions. The compliance department sent generic emails acknowledging receipt of my concerns, but never followed up with concrete actions. It became clear that the company was more interested in maintaining the illusion of compliance than in actually enforcing it, especially when it came to a high-performing manager like Eleanor, who consistently met production targets, albeit by cutting dangerous corners. The most frustrating part was the subtle retaliation. It wasn't overt, I wasn't fired or demoted. Instead, I found myself increasingly marginalized. Important projects were assigned to others. My input in meetings was often overlooked or dismissed. My performance reviews, which had once been stellar, began to include vague criticisms about my teamwork and adaptability. Eleanor, emboldened by the company's inaction, became even more audacious in her disregard for regulations. She'd sometimes make a point of violating a protocol right in front of me, with a smug look, as if to say, "See? Nothing you do matters." The psychological toll was immense. I was constantly on edge, feeling isolated and betrayed by a system I had once trusted. My passion for the work was replaced by a suffocating sense of moral compromise. I realized then that staying was no longer an option. I could not, in good conscience, continue to be associated with an organization that prioritized profit over patient safety, especially when my efforts to rectify the situation were not only ignored but punished. The decision to leave was agonizing, but it was also a profound act of self-preservation, a desperate attempt to reclaim my integrity. The day I resigned was one of the hardest and most liberating days of my professional life. I drafted my resignation letter meticulously, careful not to burn bridges entirely, but firm in my decision. I cited differences in professional philosophy and approach to regulatory compliance as my primary reason for departure. A polite euphemism for this company is a ticking time bomb, and I refuse to be on board when it explodes. Eleanor, when I informed her, merely offered a curt nod and a dismissive good luck. There was no surprise, no attempt to persuade me to stay. It was clear she considered my departure a minor inconvenience, perhaps even a relief, as it removed the one dissenting voice in her department. Leaving felt like shedding a heavy cloak of responsibility and dread. The immediate aftermath was a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. I had no new job lined up, a terrifying prospect for someone who had always been meticulously planned and career-focused. But the alternative, staying and compromising my values daily, was far more terrifying. I spent a few weeks decompressing, allowing myself to process the emotional exhaustion of the past year. I reflected on what I truly valued in a career and what kind of environment I needed to thrive. My core belief in public safety remained unshaken. If anything, my experience with Eleanor had solidified my resolve to work in a field where I could genuinely make a difference, where regulations were not just suggestions but absolute requirements. I began my job search with a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't just looking for a paycheck, I was looking for a place where integrity was paramount. My search led me to a completely different sector of regulatory enforcement, one that focused on ensuring compliance across a broad range of industries, not just pharmaceuticals. It was a government agency, a place where the rules were the rules, and enforcement was the mandate. The interview process was rigorous, focusing heavily on ethical decision-making, a deep understanding of regulatory frameworks, and an unwavering commitment to public welfare. It felt like the perfect fit. I remember the sense of quiet triumph when I received the offer letter. It wasn't just a new job, it was a fresh start, an opportunity to rebuild my career on a foundation of uncompromised principles. My new role was as a senior compliance officer, and it was everything I had hoped for. The work was challenging, intellectually stimulating, and most importantly, deeply satisfying. I was part of a team dedicated to upholding standards, investigating violations, and ensuring that businesses operated responsibly. The agency had a strong ethical culture, and my colleagues shared my commitment to public safety. There was no Eleanor here, no subtle undermining, no pressure to cut corners. The regulations were the law, and our job was to enforce them without fear or favor. I spent the next few years immersed in my new responsibilities, learning new regulations, honing my investigative skills, and contributing to a mission I truly believed in. The memory of my previous job, and Eleanor, faded into the background, a distant, unpleasant chapter one had thankfully closed. Or so I thought. Life settled into a comfortable, productive rhythm. 5 years passed quickly in my new role. I thrived in the structured, ethical environment of the regulatory agency. My expertise grew, and I became a respected member of my team, often leading complex investigations and training junior officers. The work was varied and intellectually stimulating, ranging from environmental compliance to consumer product safety, always with the underlying goal of protecting the public. The memory of Eleanor and her reckless disregard for safety protocols had receded, becoming a faint, unpleasant echo from a past life. I rarely thought of her, or the company I had left behind, so consumed was I by the present challenges and satisfactions of my current career. Then came the day that would irrevocably link my past to my present. It started like any other Monday morning. Our team lead, David, called us into the conference room for our weekly assignment briefing. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the low hum of the fluorescent lights. David clicked through a series of slides, outlining new cases, emerging trends, and resource allocations. My attention was half-focused, already mentally preparing for the usual array of minor infractions and routine audits. But then, a new slide popped up, displaying a company logo I hadn't seen in years, yet instantly recognized with a jolt that sent a chill down my spine. It was the logo of my old company, the pharmaceutical manufacturer where Eleanor Vance had reigned supreme. My breath hitched. The name of the company, Pharma Corp Solutions, flashed on the screen, accompanied by a brief summary of the incoming complaints. My mind raced. Could it be? After all these years? David continued, oblivious to the sudden shift in my demeanor. We've received a significant number of complaints regarding Pharma Corp Solutions, he stated, his voice calm and professional. Everything from alleged product quality issues to serious concerns about manufacturing practices and compliance with federal regulations. It's a big one, folks. High priority. We'll need our best team on this. He then began assigning roles, and my heart pounded as he spoke. Given the complexity and the volume of complaints, I'm putting together a dedicated task force. My name, your extensive background in pharmaceutical regulations makes you the ideal lead investigator for this case. The words hung in the air, a surreal twist of fate. My old company. The very regulations I now enforced. And I, the very person who had tried to report their dangerous practices years ago, was now tasked with investigating them. A strange mix of dread and exhilaration surged through me. Dread, because it meant confronting a painful chapter of my past. Exhilaration, because it meant a chance to finally see justice served. I looked at the company logo on the screen, then at David, my face carefully neutral. Understood, David, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. I'll get started immediately. The irony was palpable, a cosmic joke playing out in real time. The universe, it seemed, had a long memory. The initial phase of the investigation was a whirlwind of activity. My team and I began by meticulously sifting through the mountain of complaints that had accumulated against PharmaCorp Solutions. They weren't just a few isolated incidents. They represented a systemic pattern of alleged non-compliance. Complaints ranged from consumers reporting adverse reactions to products, to former employees detailing unsafe manufacturing conditions, to even a few whistleblower reports echoing the very concerns I had raised years ago. The sheer volume and consistency of the allegations were alarming, painting a picture of a company deeply entrenched in problematic practices. As I reviewed each complaint, a sense of grim familiarity washed over me. The specific types of violations being reported, inadequate quality control, improper handling of raw materials, falsified documentation, insufficient environmental monitoring, were eerily similar to the shortcuts Eleanor had championed during my time there. It was as if the company had continued down the same dangerous path, only now, the consequences were catching up to them on a much larger scale. My prior experience, once a source of personal anguish, now became an invaluable asset. I understood the nuances of their operations, the specific points of vulnerability, and the areas where they were most likely to cut corners. It gave me an almost prescient insight into where to dig deeper, what questions to ask, and what documents to scrutinize. The first major step was to issue a comprehensive request for documents. This included everything from manufacturing batch records, quality control reports, maintenance logs, employee training records, and internal audit reports, to financial statements and organizational charts. It was a massive undertaking, designed to give us a complete picture of their operations. We also began scheduling interviews with former employees who had submitted complaints, carefully preparing our questions to elicit detailed, factual information without leading them. The early interviews confirmed many of my suspicions. Former quality assurance technicians spoke of immense pressure to approve batches that didn't meet specifications. Former production managers described being told to prioritize output over safety. The stories were chillingly consistent, painting a picture of a corporate culture that actively discouraged compliance and rewarded expediency. As the documents started to trickle in, my team and I began the painstaking process of cross-referencing, analyzing, and identifying discrepancies. My heart raced as I opened the first batch of electronic files. It was like stepping back in time, but with a crucial difference. This time, I wasn't an isolated voice crying into the void. This time, I had the full weight of a federal agency behind me, and the authority to demand answers. I felt a surge of professional determination, a quiet resolve to ensure that every single violation was uncovered and addressed. The ghost of my past, the lingering frustration of being ignored, was now fueling my meticulous pursuit of the truth. This wasn't just another case, it was personal, and I was ready to bring everything I had learned to bear. The document review phase quickly became an exercise in pattern recognition, and the patterns I found were disturbingly familiar. It was like a forensic deep dive into the very same corner-cutting tactics I had witnessed and reported years ago, only now magnified and entrenched within the company's operations. I requested specific types of records that I knew Eleanor had manipulated: equipment calibration logs, environmental monitoring data for clean rooms, raw material inspection reports, and most critically, batch production records. My experience told me exactly where to look for the subtle signs of non-compliance, the telltale inconsistencies that indicated a deviation from protocol. For instance, I specifically looked for gaps in calibration records for critical manufacturing equipment. Sure enough, we found instances where equipment was used for weeks, sometimes months, past its scheduled calibration date. This meant that the accuracy of measurements crucial for product quality and safety could not be guaranteed. Then there were the environmental monitoring reports. In a highly regulated environment like pharmaceutical manufacturing, clean rooms are constantly monitored for particulate matter and microbial contamination. I remembered Eleanor's tendency to massage these numbers. And there it was, suspiciously uniform readings, day after day, week after week, even in areas where human activity or equipment operation should have caused minor fluctuations. It suggested either a complete lack of actual monitoring or, more likely, the falsification of data to present a perfect, but untrue, picture of compliance. The raw material inspection reports were another critical area. I recalled the incident with the damaged seal. Now, we found multiple instances where incoming materials were documented as inspected and accepted despite notations of damage, improper labeling, or expired certificates of analysis. These were materials that should have been rejected outright, as their quality and safety could not be assured. But the most egregious findings emerged from the batch production records. These are the comprehensive documents that track every step of the manufacturing process for a specific lot of product. We found numerous instances where critical process parameters, like mixing times, temperatures, or pressure, were recorded as being within specification, but accompanying audit trails or operator notes subtly contradicted these entries. Sometimes, a batch would be marked as reworked without proper documentation of the rework process, or a deviation would be noted but never formally investigated or resolved. It was clear that the company had developed a sophisticated system for creating the appearance of compliance, while fundamentally operating outside the regulations. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. Eleanor's methods, which I had once fought against as a junior employee, had seemingly become institutionalized. Each discovery fueled my determination. This wasn't just a job, it was a vindication. Every falsified log, every overlooked deviation, every corner cut was a piece of the puzzle, confirming what I had known all along. The meticulous review of these records was not just about building a case, it was about exposing a dangerous truth that had been hidden for too long. And somewhere in the depths of these digital files, I knew, was the definitive proof that would bring down the very empire Eleanor had helped to build. As the investigation intensified, the pieces of the puzzle began to form a clear, damning picture. The sheer volume of evidence we were uncovering pointed not just to isolated incidents, but to a deeply ingrained culture of non-compliance that permeated every level of PharmaCorp solutions, from the production floor to the executive suites. The initial complaints were just the tip of the iceberg. My team and I were now unearthing systematic failures in quality control, manufacturing processes, and regulatory reporting. One particularly disturbing pattern involved product testing. We discovered that batches of medication that failed initial quality control tests were often retested multiple times until they yielded a passing result, without proper investigation into the initial failure. This practice, known as testing into compliance, is a serious violation of good manufacturing practices because it masks underlying quality issues and can lead to unsafe products reaching the market. We found internal emails discussing the pressure to release batches, even when quality assurance personnel raised red flags. Another critical area of concern was the company's handling of consumer complaints and adverse event reports. Regulations require pharmaceutical companies to meticulously track and investigate any reports of patient harm or product defects. We found evidence that many such reports were downplayed, misclassified, or simply not reported to the regulatory authorities within the required timeframe. This was particularly egregious, as it meant that potentially dangerous products remained on the market, and patients were not being adequately protected. It was a direct betrayal of public trust, and a clear indication that the company prioritized avoiding regulatory scrutiny over patient safety. The financial records also told a story. We found instances of significant cost-cutting measures implemented across quality assurance and manufacturing departments, leading to understaffing, outdated equipment, and a lack of investment in critical compliance infrastructure. It became clear that the dangerous shortcuts weren't just the result of individual negligence. They were a deliberate business strategy aimed at maximizing profits, regardless of the risks. The irony of my former boss, Eleanor, being at the heart of this was not lost on me. Her practicality and getting things done had evidently become the company's modus operandi, leading them down a path of systemic violations. My team and I meticulously compiled our findings, building an unassailable case. We organized the evidence into clear, concise reports, cross-referencing each violation with the specific regulation it breached. The sheer weight of the evidence was overwhelming. It was no longer just about suspicion or anecdotal accounts. It was about irrefutable data, internal documents, and corroborated testimonies. The investigation was reaching its critical mass, and I knew that the next step would be to confront PharmaCorp Solutions with the full extent of our findings. The stage was set for a reckoning. The culmination of our investigative work led to the preparation of a comprehensive notice of violation, a formal document outlining every regulatory breach we had uncovered. This document was the foundation of our enforcement action, a detailed indictment of PharmaCorp Solutions' systemic failures. It ran hundreds of pages long, meticulously citing specific regulations, cross-referencing them with the evidence we had gathered, the falsified logs, the ignored complaints, the manipulated test results, the internal emails. It was a powerful and undeniable testament to their non-compliance. The day we served the notice of violation was fraught with a quiet tension. Our agency's legal team had reviewed every line, ensuring its accuracy and legal soundness. The document was delivered to PharmaCorp Solutions' corporate headquarters, signaling the official commencement of enforcement proceedings. This wasn't just a warning, it was the beginning of a process that could lead to severe penalties, including hefty fines, product recalls, and even the suspension of their operating licenses. Shortly after the notice was served, we scheduled the formal enforcement meeting. This was where our team would present our findings directly to the company's senior leadership. I remember walking into the large, sterile conference room at the agency's offices, accompanied by my team and our legal counsel. The PharmaCorp Solutions delegation was already seated. Their CEO, their head of legal, and, to my utter astonishment, Eleanor Vance herself, now seemingly in a more senior role, perhaps head of operations or even a VP. She looked older, her face etched with a new kind of weariness, but the same sharp, calculating glint was still in her eyes. Our eyes met across the polished conference table. For a fleeting moment, a flicker of recognition, perhaps even a hint of shock, crossed her face. It was quickly replaced by a mask of professional indifference, but I saw it. She knew who I was. And she knew what this meant. The irony was almost unbearable. The woman who had dismissed my concerns, threatened my career, and enabled the very practices we were now exposing, was sitting across from me, facing the consequences of her actions. I began the presentation, my voice calm and steady, devoid of any personal emotion. I laid out the facts, section by section, violation by violation, presenting the irrefutable evidence. My team members followed, each presenting their specific findings with precision and clarity. We projected the damning documents onto the screen. The doctored logs, the emails instructing employees to cut corners, the reports of uninvestigated patient complaints. The atmosphere in the room grew increasingly tense. The PharmaCorp executives, initially composed, began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Eleanor, who had started with a look of defiance, slowly began to pale. The weight of the evidence was crushing, leaving no room for denial or deflection. This was not a negotiation. It was a presentation of facts, and the facts were damning. The tables, quite literally, had turned. The meeting continued for hours, a relentless presentation of evidence that chipped away at PharmaCorp Solutions' facade of compliance. As my team and I systematically laid out the findings, citing regulation after regulation, the initial defiance on the faces of their executives slowly morphed into a grim realization. Eleanor, in particular, seemed to shrink in her seat. Her usual commanding presence was gone, replaced by a strained, almost defeated posture. She occasionally whispered to the CEO or the head of legal, but her contributions seemed to be less about rebuttal and more about quiet desperation. We presented the evidence of the testing into compliance scheme, showing how batches that failed initial quality tests were repeatedly retested until a passing result was achieved, without any root cause investigation. We projected internal emails where Eleanor herself, or someone under her direct command, had authorized the release of these questionable batches, citing production quotas or market demand. The legal team from PharmaCorp tried to interject, attempting to explain away the discrepancies as isolated incidents or clerical errors, but our evidence was too robust. We had multiple examples, cross-referenced with employee testimonies and internal audit trails that showed a clear, deliberate pattern. Then came the section on the mishandling of adverse event reports. We showed how patient complaints detailing serious side effects were logged internally but never properly reported to the FDA, or were miscategorized to avoid triggering a full investigation. We had copies of the original patient complaints, juxtaposed with the company's internal, minimized summaries, and the corresponding lack of official reports to the regulatory body. This was perhaps the most damning evidence, as it directly implicated the company in potentially endangering public health. The CEO of Pharma Corp Solutions, a man who had initially projected an air of calm confidence, now looked visibly shaken. Eleanor remained largely silent throughout this part, her gaze fixed on the projected documents, her face pale. I could see the wheels turning in her mind, perhaps recognizing the very shortcuts she had personally implemented or overseen. The irony was a sharp, clear blade. She had once threatened my career for reporting these issues. Now, her own career, and likely the very existence of the company, hung in the balance because of these issues. The meeting concluded with our agency outlining the potential penalties: multimillion-dollar fines, mandatory product recalls, a comprehensive consent decree requiring a complete overhaul of their quality systems, and the very real threat of criminal charges for individuals involved in falsifying data. The atmosphere was thick with the weight of these implications. As the Pharma Corp delegation gathered their papers, their faces were grim. Eleanor avoided my gaze, but as she walked past, I felt the silent weight of her defeat. This was just the beginning of their reckoning, but for me, it was a profound moment of vindication. The truth, finally, was out. The formal enforcement meeting was merely the first volley in what would become a prolonged and arduous process. Following our presentation, Pharma Corp Solutions was given a strict deadline to respond to the notice of violation, outlining their plan for corrective actions and their defense against the allegations. Predictably, their initial response was a mix of denial and damage control. They acknowledged some minor administrative errors but largely attempted to deflect blame, suggesting that the issues were isolated or the fault of a few rogue employees. They certainly didn't admit to the systemic failures we had so meticulously documented. This was expected. Companies rarely admit full culpability immediately. Our agency, however, was prepared for this. We initiated a series of follow-up actions, including on-site inspections of their manufacturing facilities. This was a critical step, as it allowed us to verify the documented evidence with real-world observations. I led the inspection team, and walking through the familiar halls of Pharma Corp Solutions felt like a surreal journey into my past. The same machinery, the same sterile corridors, but this time I walked with the authority of a federal officer, not a fearful employee. During the inspections, we found exactly what we expected: continued evidence of non-compliance. We observed production lines operating without proper quality checks, equipment that was clearly not maintained to standard, and a general atmosphere of cutting corners. We interviewed current employees, many of whom were hesitant to speak initially, but eventually, under the protection of our agency's authority, began to corroborate the stories of pressure and systemic issues. Some even recognized me from my previous tenure, their eyes widening in surprise and, in some cases, a flicker of hope. Eleanor was present during some of these inspections, though she maintained a professional distance, rarely engaging with me directly. Her demeanor was a stark contrast to her former self. The swagger was gone, replaced by a tense, watchful silence. She looked perpetually stressed, her eyes darting nervously as my team meticulously documented every observation, every deviation. I could sense the immense pressure she was under, the weight of the company's precarious situation resting heavily on her shoulders. The very practices she had once championed were now unraveling the company from within. The evidence from the on-site inspections further solidified our case, making it undeniable. We found physical proof of the issues we had identified in the documents: expired reagents in the quality control lab, uncalibrated scales on the production floor, and uncleaned equipment being used for different products, risking cross-contamination. Each finding was meticulously photographed, documented, and cross-referenced with our existing evidence. The cumulative weight of our findings was becoming insurmountable. PharmaCorp Solutions were slowly but surely being backed into a corner, with no viable path for escape. The next step would be to force them into a consent decree, a legally binding agreement that would dictate their path to compliance, and failure to adhere to it would mean even more severe repercussions. With the overwhelming evidence from the document review and the on-site inspections, PharmaCorp Solutions had no choice but to enter into negotiations for a consent decree. This was a legally binding agreement between the company and our agency, outlining a comprehensive plan for them to come into full compliance with all federal regulations. It wasn't a slap on the wrist, it was a complete overhaul, dictating everything from their quality management systems and manufacturing processes to their employee training and internal auditing procedures. Failure to comply with any part of the decree would result in even harsher penalties, including potentially shutting down their operations. The negotiations were protracted and intense. PharmaCorp's legal team fought hard to minimize the scope of the decree and the financial penalties, but our agency was unyielding. We had an ironclad case, and we were determined to ensure that every single one of their dangerous practices was addressed. I was heavily involved in these negotiations, providing expert testimony on the technical aspects of the violations and the necessary corrective actions. My intimate knowledge of their past operations, combined with the current evidence, made me an indispensable asset. Ultimately, PharmaCorp Solutions had to concede. The consent decree was signed, a landmark agreement that mandated sweeping changes across their entire organization. It included multimillion-dollar fines, a requirement to recall specific batches of products that were deemed unsafe, and a mandate for independent third-party audits to monitor their progress. Crucially, it also stipulated that they had to invest heavily in new equipment, increase staffing for quality assurance, and comprehensive retraining for all personnel involved in manufacturing and quality control. As part of the consent decree, our agency was given the authority to oversee their remediation efforts. This meant regular progress reports, further inspections, and, significantly, the power to approve or reject their proposed corrective actions. And this is where the final, delicious twist of fate came into play. The decree specifically mandated that PharmaCorp Solutions had to bring in external experts to train their current staff on proper regulatory compliance and good manufacturing practices. And guess who was assigned to lead that training? Me. The irony was almost too perfect. The woman who had once been dismissed, marginalized, and threatened for trying to uphold these very standards was now being paid, indirectly, by PharmaCorp Solutions to teach their employees how to do the job Eleanor Vance had failed to uphold. I remember the moment my team lead informed me of this specific clause in the decree. A wave of profound satisfaction washed over me. It wasn't about revenge in a petty sense, but about a deep, resonant sense of justice. This wasn't just about punishing past wrongs, it was about ensuring that, moving forward, patients would be safe, and the company would finally operate with the integrity it had so long abandoned. The stage was set for my return, not as a subordinate, but as the enforcer and the educator. The day I walked back into PharmaCorp Solutions, not as a disgruntled former employee, but as the lead federal oversight and training officer, was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. I wore my agency uniform, a crisp, professional symbol of the authority I now wielded. The security guards, who once knew me as a junior QA specialist, now greeted me with a respectful nod, their eyes betraying a hint of surprise. The atmosphere inside the building was palpably different. The hurried, corner-cutting energy I remembered had been replaced by a tense, almost somber quiet. Employees moved with a new sense of purpose, a palpable awareness that their every action was now under scrutiny. My first task was to conduct an initial assessment of their current staff's understanding of regulatory compliance. This involved reviewing their existing training materials, observing their daily operations, and holding preliminary discussions with various department heads. What I found was a mix of genuine ignorance and deeply ingrained bad habits. Many of the newer employees had simply been taught the PharmaCorp way, which meant following Eleanor's shortcuts. Older employees, who might have known better, had either left or been conditioned to prioritize speed over safety. It was clear that the problem was systemic, requiring a fundamental shift in mindset. Then came the moment I knew was inevitable. My first direct encounter with Eleanor Vance since the enforcement meeting. I was in a meeting room, setting up my presentation for the upcoming training sessions, when the door opened and she walked in, accompanied by a few other senior managers. Her face, already drawn, tightened visibly when she saw me. There was no pretense of a friendly greeting, no attempt at small talk. Her eyes, however, held a complex mix of resentment, humiliation, and perhaps a grudging acknowledgement of my position. "Ms., my last name," she said, her voice clipped, devoid of its former condescension. "I understand you'll be leading the compliance training." It wasn't a question, but a statement laced with thinly veiled disdain. "That's correct, Ms. Vance," I replied, my voice calm and professional, betraying none of the internal satisfaction I felt. "As per the consent decree, my team and I will be implementing a comprehensive training program to ensure all relevant personnel understand and adhere to federal regulations." I made sure to emphasize all relevant personnel, knowing full well that included her. She simply nodded, her jaw tight. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. She was no longer the all-powerful boss, and I was no longer the easily dismissed subordinate. She was now under my oversight, her company's future dependent on her compliance with the very rules she had once flouted. It wasn't about gloating, but about the profound satisfaction of seeing justice served, not through petty revenge, but through the unwavering application of the law. The training sessions would be rigorous, and I intended to ensure that every single employee, from the newest hire to the most senior executive, understood the gravity of their responsibilities. This was the beginning of their long road to redemption, and I was the one leading them down it. The training sessions began, and I approached them with the utmost professionalism, despite the personal history. My goal wasn't to humiliate anyone, but to instill a deep, unshakable understanding of regulatory compliance and its critical importance to patient safety. The first sessions were mandatory for all personnel involved in manufacturing, quality control, and even senior management. I started with the basics: the purpose of regulations, the potential consequences of non-compliance, and the ethical responsibilities of working in the pharmaceutical industry. I used real-world examples, not just from Pharma Corp's own violations, though those were implicitly understood, but from other companies that had faced severe penalties for similar infractions. I emphasized the human cost of cutting corners, the patients who could be harmed, the public trust that could be eroded. I brought in case studies, interactive exercises, and open Q&A sessions to encourage engagement, though initial participation was hesitant, especially from the older, more entrenched staff. Eleanor Vance was a mandatory attendee at all the senior management training sessions. She sat in the front row, usually with her arms crossed, a stoic expression on her face. She rarely asked questions, but I could feel her eyes on me, observing, analyzing. I made a point of addressing her directly during discussions, asking for her input on specific scenarios, forcing her to articulate her understanding of the regulations she had once ignored. It was a subtle but powerful reversal of roles. She, the former mentor, was now the student, being quizzed by her former protégé. During one session on data integrity, I presented examples of common methods of falsifying records, backdating entries, selective retesting, omitting critical information. I explained the severe legal consequences for such actions, including criminal charges for individuals. As I spoke, I could see Eleanor's jaw clench, a faint flush rising on her neck. It was clear that these were not abstract concepts to her. They were the very tactics she had employed. I didn't call her out directly, but the unspoken implication hung heavy in the air. Beyond the formal training, my team and I also implemented practical, hands-on workshops on the production floor. We demonstrated proper equipment calibration, correct aseptic techniques, and meticulous documentation practices. We worked side by side with their employees, guiding them through the correct procedures, correcting their ingrained bad habits, and answering their questions patiently. It was a slow, painstaking process of re-education, breaking down years of ingrained non-compliance. Some employees were genuinely receptive, eager to learn the right way. Others were resistant, viewing it as an unnecessary burden imposed by external forces. But regardless of their individual attitudes, they had no choice but to comply. The consent decree was clear, and our presence was a constant reminder of the stakes. This wasn't just about passing a training course, it was about fundamentally changing the way Pharma Corp Solutions operated from the ground up. The training wasn't just about lectures and workshops, it was also about fostering a culture of accountability and transparency. I introduced new reporting mechanisms for employees to safely and anonymously report concerns, a stark contrast to the dismissive environment I had experienced years ago. We emphasized that compliance was everyone's responsibility, from the newest technician to the CEO. This was a direct counterpoint to Eleanor's previous approach, where compliance was seen as a burden to be circumvented. One of the most impactful parts of the training was the module on Speak Up culture. I shared stories, without naming names, of individuals who had faced retaliation for reporting concerns, and how that ultimately led to catastrophic failures for their companies. Then, I contrasted that with examples of companies that embraced open communication, where employees felt empowered to raise issues without fear of reprisal, leading to early detection and prevention of problems. I explained the legal protections for whistleblowers and the agency's commitment to investigating all legitimate reports. I could see the subtle shifts in the room, the hesitant glances exchanged among employees, as if realizing for the first time that they truly had a voice. Eleanor, during these sessions, remained largely impassive, but I noticed a flicker in her eyes when I spoke about the personal and professional consequences of enabling non-compliance. She saw the faces of the employees, some of whom had clearly suffered under her previous regime, now looking at me with a newfound sense of hope. The weight of her past actions, once dismissed, was now being laid bare in front of her own staff, without me having to utter a single accusatory word. The truth, presented calmly and factually, was its own powerful indictment. Beyond the formal training, I also held private meetings with key department heads, including Eleanor, to discuss their specific roles in implementing the changes mandated by the consent decree. In these one-on-one sessions, the professional veneer sometimes cracked. Eleanor, while still guarded, occasionally revealed glimpses of frustration or even a grudging respect for the thoroughness of our investigation. She would ask pointed questions, not to challenge the regulations, but to understand the nuances of their application, a stark contrast to her previous dismissive attitude. It was clear she was now grappling with the full implications of her past decisions. The training period was extensive, lasting several months, as we worked through every department and every level of the organization. By the end, there was a noticeable shift. Employees were asking more informed questions, proactively identifying potential issues, and demonstrating a clearer understanding of their responsibilities. The initial resistance had largely given way to a cautious acceptance, and in many cases, genuine engagement. It wasn't just about ticking boxes for the consent decree, it was about fundamentally changing the DNA of the company. And as I looked out at the faces of the newly trained staff, I knew that the seeds of true compliance had finally been sown. As the formal training sessions wound down, our oversight role transitioned into a continuous monitoring phase. The consent decree mandated regular reporting from Pharma Corp Solutions, detailing their progress on corrective actions, internal audit findings, and ongoing compliance metrics. My team and I reviewed these reports meticulously, cross-referencing them with our own follow-up inspections and, crucially, with the anonymous reports that continued to trickle in through our agency's channels. This ensured that the changes weren't just superficial, but deeply embedded within the company's operations. The transformation at Pharma Corp Solutions was slow, but discernible. New quality control procedures were implemented, equipment calibration schedules were rigorously adhered to, and environmental monitoring data finally began to show realistic fluctuations, indicating genuine testing rather than fabricated perfection. The internal culture also started to shift. Employees, now empowered by the Speak Up training and the visible presence of our agency, were more willing to raise concerns. This led to early identification of potential issues, allowing the company to address them proactively before they escalated into major violations. Eleanor Vance remained at the company, a testament to her tenacity, or perhaps her lack of other viable options. However, her role had clearly diminished. She was no longer the decision-maker dictating shortcuts. She was now an executive operating under strict oversight, forced to adhere to the very regulations she had once scorned. I observed her during my periodic visits. She attended meetings, participated in discussions, and even oversaw some of the new compliance initiatives, but her influence was clearly curtailed. The swagger she once possessed was entirely gone, replaced by a subdued, almost resigned demeanor. She was a shadow of her former self, a manager stripped of her reckless autonomy. One day, during a routine follow-up inspection, I found myself walking past Eleanor's office. The door was ajar, and I could hear her on the phone, her voice low and strained. I caught snippets of the conversation: budget cuts, reduced authority, restructuring. It became clear that while she hadn't been fired, her power had been significantly eroded. The company, under the pressure of the consent decree and the massive fines, was undergoing a painful but necessary restructuring, and Eleanor was clearly feeling the pinch. It wasn't direct revenge, but it was a powerful demonstration of consequences. The satisfaction I felt wasn't malicious glee, but a profound sense of closure and justice. It wasn't just about Eleanor. It was about ensuring that a company that had once endangered public health was now forced to operate responsibly. The regulations I had once fought for and been dismissed over were now being rigorously enforced, and I was at the helm of that enforcement. The circle was complete. The woman who had once threatened my career was now facing severe penalties and a diminished role, all because of the very principles I had refused to abandon. And the company she helped build was finally being forced to do the right thing. As the months turned into a year under the consent decree, the changes at PharmaCorp Solutions became more deeply ingrained. The initial resistance had largely faded, replaced by a grudging acceptance and, in many cases, a genuine understanding of the benefits of compliance. The company was still struggling financially under the weight of the fines and the cost of remediation, but their operational integrity was undeniably improving. My team and I continued our oversight, conducting unannounced inspections, reviewing quarterly reports, and ensuring that the momentum for change was maintained. My interactions with Eleanor Vance became even more infrequent and purely professional. She was still present, a fixture in the senior management team, but her responsibilities seemed to have shifted away from direct operational control, perhaps to less critical areas. She avoided eye contact with me whenever possible, and our conversations were limited to brief, formal exchanges about compliance metrics or project updates. The power dynamic had been irrevocably altered, and she was clearly uncomfortable with her diminished status and my elevated authority. One afternoon, during a final comprehensive audit before the agency considered scaling back its direct oversight, I was reviewing some updated organizational charts. I noticed a subtle but significant change. Eleanor Vance's title had been altered. She was no longer listed as a vice president or head of operations. Her new title was something like senior advisor, special projects, a vague, almost ceremonial role that clearly indicated a significant reduction in her direct influence and decision-making power. It was a quiet demotion, a consequence of the company's need to demonstrate a fundamental shift in leadership responsible for quality and compliance. The company was effectively sidelining her, a necessary step to regain regulatory trust. It was a stark reminder of how far things had come. Years ago, she had been the one with the power, the one who could make or break careers, including mine. Now, her own career had been effectively sidelined, not by my direct action, but by the relentless application of the very regulations she had disregarded. It wasn't a moment of triumph for me, but rather a quiet confirmation of the efficacy of the system. Justice wasn't always swift, but it was often inevitable. The most satisfying part of this final phase was seeing the current staff. They were no longer the fearful, compliant automatons I had once known. They were asking questions, challenging processes, and actively participating in improving their quality systems. They were taking pride in their work, knowing that they were producing safe, high-quality products. I saw technicians meticulously calibrating equipment, quality assurance specialists diligently reviewing batch records, and managers actively promoting a culture of compliance. This was the real victory. Not just the downfall of one individual's reckless reign, but the fundamental transformation of an entire organization, ensuring public safety for years to come. My mission was nearing its completion, and the impact was profound and lasting. The final phase of the consent decree was approaching its conclusion. PharmaCorp Solutions had demonstrated consistent progress over the past year and a half, investing heavily in new infrastructure, retraining their entire workforce, and implementing robust quality management systems. Our agency's oversight, once intensive, had gradually tapered as the company proved its commitment to sustainable compliance. My role became less about direct intervention and more about periodic verification, ensuring that the positive changes were deeply embedded and self-sustaining. I remember the last formal meeting with Pharma Corp Solutions leadership, held at our agency's headquarters. It was a review of their final compliance report, a thick binder detailing every corrective action, every audit result, and every metric demonstrating their adherence to the consent decree. The CEO, looking far more relieved than he had 2 years prior, presented the findings with a newfound humility and a genuine acknowledgement of the journey they had undergone. Eleanor Vance was not present at this final meeting. Her absence was a quiet but powerful statement. Her senior advisor, special projects role had evidently become so peripheral that her presence was no longer deemed necessary for such a critical discussion. It was the ultimate confirmation of her diminished influence, a stark contrast to her former position at the helm of their operations. She had been effectively phased out, a casualty of the very recklessness she had championed. As the meeting concluded, and the agency officially acknowledged Pharma Corp Solutions' successful completion of the consent decree, a wave of profound satisfaction washed over me. It wasn't just about the company's compliance, it was about the vindication of a principle. I had stood firm years ago, refusing to compromise my integrity, even when it meant risking my career. Now, that unwavering commitment had not only led to my professional success but had also directly contributed to holding a powerful corporation accountable and ensuring public safety. Walking out of that meeting, I felt a deep sense of closure. The long, arduous journey had come to an end. The initial frustration and helplessness I felt when my concerns were dismissed had been replaced by the quiet triumph of seeing justice prevail. It wasn't a dramatic, Hollywood-esque confrontation, but a methodical, persistent application of the law, proving that even the most entrenched systems of non-compliance could be dismantled. My career at the agency continued, of course, with new cases and new challenges. But the Pharma Corp Solutions case would always stand out. It was a powerful reminder that integrity, persistence, and an unwavering commitment to public safety could indeed make a profound difference. And as I looked back, I realized that the woman who had once threatened my career had, in an ironic twist of fate, inadvertently set me on the path to becoming the very force that brought her and her company to justice. It was a full-circle moment, a testament to the enduring power of ethical conviction.